This is Defender Radio. Defender Radio is brought to you by the Association for the Protection of Fur-Bearing Animals.
It's the week of June 12, 2017, and this is Michael Howie welcoming you to episode 433 of Defender Radio. Wildlife corridors are becoming beautiful and iconic scientific feats that show our ability to coexist with animals when we put our minds to it. And the TransCanada Highway through Banff National Park is perhaps the best example of that. Twinning of the highway, or doubling its width, began in 1981, and with it, a bold plan to make it safer for animals to get across the busy highway. Today, more than 40 corridors of multiple designs serve the animals, and the latest research is highlighting the incredible success of the program managed by Parks Canada. Wildlife collisions have reduced by more than 80% and almost 90% for various ungulates such as deer, moose, and bighorn sheep. In 1996, scientists began monitoring the crossings, and that voluminous dataset shows successful behavioural adaptations, improved or maintained genetic diversity, and a halting to ecological fragmentation. To discuss the monitoring, what scientists are learning, and why the results matter, Defender Radio was joined by Ecological Integrity Monitoring Coordinator for Parks Canada, Derek Petersen. Why did the animal cross the road? Maybe that's the overly obvious place that we should start. Why are animals going across?
Sure. Well, if you think about a natural landscape before humans embedded ourselves into it, it would have been one contiguous span of available habitat for wildlife species, and they would, pick and choose according to their needs. So there would be no barriers to their movements. Any mortality source to them would be from natural causes, and most often obviously predators. And so when we started putting our human infrastructure on the landscape, especially our road networks, we created barriers to essentially started separating and segregating habitat into smaller blocks. And then, animals that were used to accessing habitats in a broader area then were confronted with this transportation corridor, and it could be either railway or highway. And with the traveling vehicles, then obviously their habitat then became fragmented, plus there was also the potential of mortality when they were trying to cross a road and access some of those habitats, which they had traditionally done for generations.
Well, and that's something that we're hearing more and more about is fragmentation as a serious ecological harm, both for the obvious mortality of simply crossing roads and landscapes like that, but also everything from how woodlots interact with the rest of an ecosystem. I remember reading a lot about that several years ago. There would be in a municipality, they'd set aside, okay, well, this is going to be a parkland, this is going to be a woodlot, but they wouldn't connect to anything. And sure enough, over time, and it may not be in 5 years, maybe in 50 years, but that woodlot would very quickly start to die off because there was no connectivity to the rest of the ecosystem.
Yeah. If you just have a bunch of small isolated patches, they just become either inaccessible or unusable for the wildlife species.
Yeah, and now in the case of Banff National Park, we're looking at huge areas of lands with relatively significant highways going through them. So how do we identify then that I guess maybe we'll sort of go on. How do we identify which animals need to be using these crossings, and how do we sort of sort that out? Because one of the very early comments I heard about this in a very negative way was that, well, we're just going to create tunnels and the wolves or the coyotes or the bears are going to sit and lay in wait and make like some kind of like slaughterhouse. But that isn't what happens. So how does all of this knowledge we have about sort of ecology then play into these, at times, relatively small pieces of tunnel?
Yeah, so a couple of things with just general wildlife observations and an understanding of ecological needs of a variety of species. You can you can sort of understand what their general landscape habitat needs are, and you can start to map those out on the landscape, and then you can identify, which are the key habitat areas that need to be connected, and that can in some way influence where you wish to put in your highway mitigations. Another big part of the study was just looking at mortality strikes on the highway, so looking at the historical records of wildlife vehicle collisions, obviously, and then plotting those through GIS on maps, and you tend to come up with some hotspots, which are indicative of areas that are naturally used by animals for crossing one side of the highway to the other. And so that gives you some indication of, okay, this is a probable spot where animals would want to go naturally. You also look at the terrain, and there's certainly a number of environmental variables that were considered when in the planning stages for identifying which locations the crossing structures should go in. Tying in crossing structures to landscape drainages especially was a key thing. And certain species, have different needs for their crossing. Some like wide open areas where they can, see other animals, especially predators. Some animals prefer accessing a crossing structure that's heavily forested, so they have cover right up to the point of entering a crossing structure. So a whole host of both environmental and structural variables were considered in the planning stage before any shovels hit the ground as far as actual mitigations being built.
Well, and now that those have been built, and that will be covered in a separate interview, the sort of more engineering side of things, it's the numbers are hard to really sort of grapple with. And I think this is what really makes the work you and Parks Canada are doing very unique. Is, one thing I've read is that you've reduced wildlife vehicle collisions and mortality of by over 80%, and nearly 90% for ungulates. So that's going to be our deer, moose, caribou. And just in through 2016, there were 165,734 individual animal crossings.
Of seven large mammal species. Yeah, in the 17 years that have the TransCanada Highway was monitored.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. Although I'm pretty sure when I have spent time in Toronto, I've seen that many raccoons go through backyards. But I kind of have to ask, how do you even start? When you, as the person who is monitoring this data, who is reviewing this data, when you have numbers of this volume, how do you begin to break that down into, I'd say, almost like usable information?
Yeah, so we inherited the ongoing monitoring program, which is what we're continuing to this day and will continue on into the future. But the research, so the actual twinning, the highway construction aspect started, way back in 1988, and the research actually started in 1996. And there were 3 phases of research between 1996 and 2014. The first 5 years between 96 and 2002, have some pretty simple objectives. One was this combination of highway crossing structures and wildlife exclusion fencing actually reducing mortality. So that was a key question. That was one of the principal objectives of the project initially. And corollary to that was one of the main objectives of the whole of the twinning project, is essentially to reduce the human mortality on the highway as well, and the human injury and vehicle damage, etc., both from wildlife vehicle collisions and from just general vehicle accidents. So certainly that was a key objective. So looking at does this combination fencing and crossing structure reduce highway mortality? Are the structures being used? This was a big question. Parks Canada certainly wasn't the first agency in the world to sort of begin designing and building crossing structures. There were certainly some efforts over in Europe that were considered at the time, varying things, and some limited work in the United States as well. But certainly in the scope that Parks Canada took it on was the first in the world. So we're were the structures being used? How were different species using those structures? And, were there differences in how species selected? Were different species using different kinds of structures? And there were seven different structures that were used that are in use on the TransCanada Highway. So again, the program was looking at trying to facilitate, again, the 11 large mammal species that we document through our monitoring, but there's an additional host of species that use the structures that just aren't our focus. And so they wanted to try a whole suite of different structures, anywhere from 1.6 meter culvert up to our 60 meter overpasses. And then again, looking at, okay, how are animals using those different kinds of structures, and how does that change over time? So those were some key questions of that first round of research. And how can that information be used for subsequent design work and planning of future twinning, both within Banff National Park, but certainly elsewhere in the world? This information became of critical value to a number of agencies who were just recognizing the need to do similar kinds of mitigations.
Having this information available to the world is of vital interest. And, there's one stat I know of. In 2007, in British Columbia, the province spent almost $1 million on just removal of animal carcasses from the highways that they monitor and operate. That does not include the insurance cost. That does not include the cost of actual, the moral or
claims.
Yeah, exactly, or ecological damage to the animals, to the people, to the road itself. So we're talking millions of dollars at stake here every year. And again, on a larger highway that is full of people surrounded by wildlife, you can only imagine that number just skyrockets.
Well, you can imagine a major thoroughfare like the TransCanada Highway, and the stats we have, there's one vehicle, there's between 17 and 30,000 vehicles a day, which equates to one vehicle roughly every 3 seconds.
Wow.
So you could imagine if you're a sensitive wildlife species standing on one side of a 4-lane divided highway, thinking pre-mitigation, but thinking you want and need to get to the other side for a variety of reasons, how imposing that would be.
Well, and, this is where it gets, to me, very fun kind of to think about, is how do these different animals use the structures? Because again, my initial thought would be, well, a deer isn't going to want to go into a tunnel. Right? They like the big open spaces, and they're going to be afraid of predators, but the majority of the animals you are monitoring are ungulates. You've got white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, moose, mountain goats, bighorn sheep listed here. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to get into the Latin names because I'll just embarrass both of us. So why are these animals, particularly the prey species, using these things and it seems counterintuitive that they would?
Yeah, and certainly again, that's where part of the selection comes in, because with that range of seven crossing structures, again, the overpasses are one option, but a number of them are what are called an open span underpass. So which mostly relate to, if you think of driving any highway, whenever there's a river crossing or anything, you'll have those big open steel structures. A number of those were retrofitted to have kind of a terrestrial walkway adjacent to the watercourse. So it combined both, the need for aquatic connectivity, but it also provided the terrestrial bridge underneath those. So if you think of those and then cement box culverts and scaling down from there to metal culverts, anything from a 4 meter by 7 meter to, as I mentioned, the 1.6 meter. So again, the variety of options for animals to select. And that certainly, it changed over time for some species. We certainly found initially that certain species favored certain crossing structures, and things like grizzly bears, wolves, and moose certainly favored the overpasses, sort of the wide open, and then black bears and cougars favored the more covered, smaller underpass kinds of structures. And it seems like deer and the ungulates didn't really show a preference too much to particular crossing types, which again might seem somewhat counterintuitive, but that seemed to be what the data was showing. And what was really found out was that actually structure type trumps location, which was interesting. Again, a person might have thought that sort of environmental variables would be the key driver in crossing structure use, but it was actually determined that the type of structure, again, as I mentioned, trumped location, which was a result that wasn't, I think, initially predicted.
Well, yeah, you would think that the environmental factors such as, okay, well, this is a clear opening, or there's a lot of trees here, so they're not going to bolt from one side to the other, or all of these, various things would, or even I would guess sort of if you have any sort of slightly lowered roadway with the environment sloping upwards away from it. All of these things you would think are what would cause an animal to want to cross. Mm-hmm. But they're really adapting to the available resource, just like they would any other resource, I guess.
Yeah, and they're really, they're seeking out the crossing structures. And so again, what might not have been a perfect location for, they seem to be perfectly comfortable with shifting their movement slightly. And remember, we have 82 kilometers of highway and 44 crossing structures. So I think that's about 1.6. So just about every mile there's some kind of crossing structure. Again, not all of those meet all species needs, but there certainly is that's why I guess we can report that this stretch of mitigated highway has the most crossing structures and fencing anywhere on the planet, just because of that density of both. And it was interesting that on phase 3B, which was the last section completed from what's called Castle Junction to the Continental Divide, the BC-Alberta border, there were underpasses put in first, and certainly bears navigated to those right away. But as soon as the overpasses adjacent to those were completed, crossing shifted immediately to the overpass structures. And so it shows a clear sort of preference for, again, by grizzly bears, for those wide open overpass structures.
Now, do you think this is the kind of data, and while this may not be sort of your subject of study, that others can take this data and then start learning about the species themselves as a result?
Yeah, it certainly provides, and there were a number of other studies done as well for this project, because the kind of the barrier, the fragmentation effects of highways fragment both habitats, so it fragments kind of food availability from that perspective, but it also fragments genetic interchange, which is to wildlife resilience over time. And so there were a couple of studies done, one focusing on bears and one focusing on wolverines, that looked at that whole DNA question and found some interesting results. Certainly the conclusion was that for bears, there was no genetic barrier created by the mitigated highway, which was certainly good news. And then for wolverine, there was some impact to female dispersal, but not to genetic, or not to male movement. So there was enough male movement to create the sort of the genetic diversity that's necessary in a healthy population. So again, the mitigations proved effective in dealing with that genetic barrier effect that roads can create.
Yeah, and the lack of genetic variation and diversity is a big problem when we're looking at conservation, of course, and that can influence the way disease spreads. It can influence birth rates, declines, I can't talk anymore. Nope. I'm going to let you say this word for me. The ability to adapt.
Adaptability?
There it is. Adaptability.
There we go.
I that happens probably once a week to me. I hit a word and it's not there. It was philosophical last week. I couldn't say it.
There we go.
Fortunately, I had another scientist on the phone who said it for me. It seems to work out that way.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that works.
And I think, too, of interest, and I don't I don't know if this was covered in your study. You focused on these large mammals, but we're also then looking at the small mammals that are going to be crossing, insects, amphibians. You mentioned having waterways open. All of this creates a wonderful connectivity, which is a major, major issue these days. Is there any way to quantify the environmental benefit, not just to the animals, but to the ecosystem as a whole from having connectivity over, under, and through major highways?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, we pick up, so our monitoring system now is based on remote cameras. It started way back when they would look at, technology wasn't quite as advanced, so they used simple things like track pads, winter tracking, of course. Some camera work, they'd look at using strands of barbed wire, and they'd collect hair and look at DNA to identify crossing structures. And now we've moved exclusively to remote wildlife cameras. And so, obviously we collect data on whatever is moving through those structures and triggering our cameras. And so we get, beyond the sort of the 11 targeted species, we do get information on a suite of other species that are using those structures. We know that certainly the overpasses are important for bird movement across the highway. Some of the last mitigations in phase 3B were tied to, there were different structures, different underpass structures designed to allow things like harlequin ducks to be able to fly up the rivers and cross under the highways that way, which is, again, a species that hadn't been considered until that final phase. And now we're just, because we're up at the Continental Divide and up higher in elevation, we're looking at a different, providing mitigations for a different suite of species. And so most notably wolverine, lynx, and mountain goat. And there's just a current twinning project. The federal government announced just about $87 million for 6 kilometers of mitigated twinning in Yoho National Park, which is just on the other side of Banff into British Columbia. And so again, they're looking at a suite of crossing structures there that will accommodate, again, a different suite of species just because of the elevational change. So that's important. I guess back to your original question, my job, my position with Parks Canada is to lead the Ecological Integrity Monitoring Program for Banff, Yoho, and Kootenay National Parks. So we have a suite of 15 ecological measures that we track over time. And so I guess some of those larger questions of kind of the ecological health of some of our key natural resources, that data is collected through this broader EI monitoring program. And if we were to especially, it's kind of intended to be a bit of a canary in the coal mine, and if we identify that there are problems with some of our natural resources, then that suggests follow-up research to try and determine the cause and effect for that. So if we were seeing major declines in some of our wildlife populations that we're monitoring, then we would certainly go back and look at, okay, are the transportation corridors, potentially some part of that decline, and then we would look at mitigations in that way. And I guess conversely, the other way, if our populations are doing well, we would look at we would consider the causes for the situation, and I suspect that our mitigated highways would be a major player in that positive outcome.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a significant environmental change. So if you're seeing positive growth and you're seeing, in regarding the genetic diversity, you're seeing it maintained or improved, then it is reasonable to assume that the mitigation is playing a role in it, unless there's something other major going on, which I don't think there is.
Yeah. No, that certainly is, and just having dealt with the highway mortality in such a significant way, and that obviously, and that's over the entire period. Certainly, there were a number of retrofits made to the fencing design after the first phase was done. The first phase didn't have a buried apron, and there were initially problems with some smaller carnivores were able to dig under the fence and still access the highway. So in the subsequent phases, there's been a buried apron that's been part of the fencing design that has had a significant improvement on certainly addressing that fact from the first phase. So yeah, it's a learning process for everyone.
Yep.
And it'd be interesting for you to get Terry's perspective on that from a highway engineer.
Absolutely. And that's also, I mean, that's kind of the scientific process in itself, right? Is
kind of the adaptive process.
Yeah. It's, have a hypothesis, try it out, observe the results, and adapt. Now, one thing I did bring up, and I don't know if this has been looked at all, I think you can probably speak to it, is the complaint or the assumption that predators are going to use these to lay in wait. Is there any evidence, just sort of straight out, that this is causing any kind of negative impact on that predator-prey relationship?
No, I don't think the crossing structures are. I do believe, and I wasn't part of this study, but I do believe there was an issue at a couple of locations of the highway fencing where it was put up in kind of what had been traditional escape territory for bighorn sheep. I think the carnivores, for a short period, figured out that there was an opportunity for them to basically corner. They would force some of the bighorn sheep down to the fence line, and essentially it created a bit of a trap.
Yeah.
So there were a number of mitigations done, including putting kind of a visual barrier into the fence. So kind of that green screen netting you see often in locations where fencing has been done, just to make the bighorn sheep visually aware that the fence is there. And my understanding is that very adequately mitigated that initial concern.
That's pretty. It's one of these things where it's you kind of, you picture all of you guys sitting around a table and say, why don't we just put a net up? It's, you're expecting some kind of really deep conversation, but it was probably someone said, let's try this.
And I suspect it could be a rancher or a farmer somewhere in who knows where that has done something like this for decades, and is within the conservation community. The whole science of road ecology has certainly grown in the last 2 decades, and much more conversation and sharing of information, and that's how these things get dealt with.
And then there's one thing I wanted to check on. There was a story earlier this year around Canmore. I believe this is the provincial wildlife corridors. There were concerns that people are using them, particularly people with off-leash dogs. Has this been an issue for Parks Canada in and around Banff?
No, more so in the fact that most of our crossing structures, all of the overpasses, there's no human access allowed, and most of the underpasses as well, with the exception of just a couple of underpasses that have recognized kind of historical recreational access across the TransCanada Highway, and that has been maintained. But again, certainly a large communication program happens simultaneously with the highway mitigations, just advising people of the sensitivity of these structures and the need for allowing wildlife to use them unencumbered by public use.
All right, so that would be an obvious concern, I think, and I know in my old community of Oakville, Ontario, there's a lot of talk about introducing some of the small-scale corridors, and that's obviously a sort of a concern. I think it's probably more concern in these urban settings, or at least in the more traditionally accessed park settings, whereas you're dealing on the TransCanada Highway, where pulling over is against the law, as far as I know, in most locations. So I imagine it's probably simply just not something you're going to see very often.
No, and with the fencing, there are certainly gates to make those sites accessible for us in our monitoring and for a variety of maintenance and other reasons. But there's not a lot of public activity. There's not a lot of easy access to the crossing structures. And again, that's part of the design considerations that go into both the locations, the structures, and the fencing.
Absolutely. And I think to wrap up, the question has to be kind of what now? I mean, we are. I don't think anyone can debate, based on the evidence that you're producing, that these crossings don't work. I mean, we're seeing a massive reduction in wildlife vehicle collisions, with mortality rates plummeting, which is significant in and of itself, both economically and ecologically. We're seeing that genetic diversity is including. We are presuming that, based on, again, that genetic diversity, the drop in mortality and so on, and healthy populations on both sides, that the ecosystem as a whole may be improving. So what's next in terms of the research? Is it continuing to watch this and adapt as we go, or are you going to be looking in new directions?
Well, we've committed to maintain the camera monitoring system, just because we're now at 21 years in this data set, and long-term data sets are quite rare in the ecological world. And so we've made the commitment that we will continue with the ongoing monitoring of the crossing structures. Again, just to look at long-term changes in either species or levels of use. Certainly information is being used to plan for other mitigations, as I mentioned, both within Parks Canada and across the world. This information is providing guidance for that. We've used it for a small section of highway we mitigated in Cooney National Park, a 15-kilometer section there that was finished last year, so that information has been transported. I guess what we will continue to do is, just because as we move westward with the twinning, as I mentioned, we're moving into a different suite of species, and we're moving into different ecosystem types into Yoho National Park in British Columbia. So it's important to continue to initiate the monitoring when we do the highway mitigations, just to pick up, again, different species or different ecosystems, to make sure that these mitigations are working as effectively there as they have been shown to work in Banff National Park.
To find out more about the work being done with wildlife corridors by Parks Canada, visit pc.gc.ca. That's it for this week, folks. I want to thank Derek for sharing his time, and remind all of you that the second part of this episode series will be available next Tuesday, where we talk more about wildlife corridors with a Parks Canada engineer who's been involved with the projects since the 1980s. Until then, this is Michael Howie for Defender Radio, reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.